Good morning, church. It's time to go ahead and begin our morning class. For those of you that are in the foyer, please make your way to your classrooms so your teachers can get started. I'm actually going to start a little more promptly this morning because I'm running behind on this series. So I'm going to be moving a little bit faster this morning. I want to welcome all of our visitors. Also want to welcome those that are watching on the live streaming. We're glad to have you with us. We've been covering over the last 8 or 9 weeks 1 Samuel, talking about David. Last week we covered chapter 24, and we'll go ahead and get started with a quick review of some of that. You'll notice the slide background this morning is of the Blue Angels, and had to put this up there because of Veterans Day coming up. That would be a good way to honor some of our service people. But last week we talked about chapter 24. The chapter started off with Saul learning about David's location. He found out where he was. So once he finds out, Saul goes after David. He goes to meet him in front of the rock of the wild goats. And while there, Saul felt the call of nature. And when he went to relieve himself, he just happened to do so in front of a cave, or in an opening of a cave, where David and his men were hiding. At that time, David's men were trying to tell David that Saul had been delivered to him and that he should kill him, citing a prophecy. But we later learned that David did not follow their advice. David finds a way, we're not sure how, but he finds a way to cut off a piece of Saul's robe. And we read about how David's conscience bothered him tremendously because of him cutting Saul's robe. It wasn't because of the severity of the action, but it was because of who it was done against. He took this action against his king. In doing this, he has not only raised his hand against his king, but also against God, because God raised Saul as the king. But David would not allow his men to hurt Saul. He rebuked them, would not let them do it. But after Saul was finished with his business, David called out to him. David was respectful to Saul. He bowed down before him and prostrated himself. It's hardly something you would have thought David would have done, considering what Saul had been trying to kill him for so many times. Saul then replies to David with tears. He tells David that he is more righteous than he is. He then admits that he knows that David will be the king and asks that David will not cut off his descendants. And David then swears that he will not cut off Saul's descendants. We then read that Saul returned to his home, and then David went back to his stronghold. Some of the application that we took from last week was to acknowledge that we will be mistreated in this life. It's just a fact of life. We need to accept that and recognize that it's going to happen. We should also recognize that it's going to be natural for us to have the feelings of revenge. We should resist those, and ultimately we must leave these matters in the hands of God. Let Him deal with it and have the revenge, not us. As I said, I've fallen at least 2 chapters behind, so we're going to be picking up the pace, and as an adjustment, I'm not going to be bringing up all of the text from the Bible verses up here on the screen. Just going to be summarizing as we move through. I apologize, but I did get a little bogged down in those earlier chapters. But as we get started in 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 1, we learn that David suffered a great loss. Samuel has died. Samuel has been one of the central personalities of the book of Samuel, which is named after him. He was one of those who designated and anointed Saul and Israel's first king in chapters 9 and 10. He was also the prophet who informed Saul that his kingship was going to be taken away in chapters 13 and 15. Samuel was the prophet who anointed David as Saul's replacement in chapter 16. Samuel was a man whom David could flee when he was being pursued in chapter 19, verses 18 through 24. And now we read that Samuel is dead. You have to feel like David is feeling a great loss in this situation. David, along with many of the other Israelites, go to Samuel's home at Ramah, where he mourns for this great man of God. And after his time of mourning, David once again goes into hiding in the wilderness of Paran. In chapter 25, verses 2 through 8, we read about two new characters that are brought into this story, Abigail and Nabal. In verses 2 and 3, we're first introduced to these two, a man named Nabal and his wife Abigail. Nabal is a very wealthy man, at least by ancient standards. His home is in Maon, and his livestock are kept in Carmel, a few miles away. It is here near Carmel that David and his men have been hiding for some time. We are told that he is harsh and evil in his doings in verse 3. But by contrast, his wife Abigail is a wonderful blend of good looks and good thinking. David learns that Nabal is shearing his sheep. When the shearing is done, there is a time of celebration for all of the workers and for anyone else nearby who is not so fortunate. We know that at such times, the law of Moses instructed the Israelites to be generous with those who were not so fortunate. We see reference to that in Deuteronomy chapter 14 and Nehemiah chapter 8. For David to ask Nabal for a gift is not unusual at all. And since David's men had contributed to Nabal's well-being and wealth, David's request is even more reasonable. So David sends 10 of his young men to Nabal, who greet Nabal in David's name and pronounce a blessing upon him and his household. They call Nabal's attention to the fact that it is shearing time, reminding him that their presence has not been detrimental to him, but they have actually performed for Nabal a very beneficial service. David's men have not harmed any of Nabal's servants. Indeed, David and his men have actually protected Nabal's flock and shepherds. Nabal is encouraged to ask his servants to verify the truth of these words, and so it is they very politely ask Nabal for a gift, waiting patiently and expecting a response from him. As we get into verses 9 through 13, we see that Nabal returns evil for good. You have David's 10 men standing there before Nabal, waiting for a response, and for more specifically, for a gift. In verse 10, I actually do want to read verse 10 there. But Nabal answered David's servants and said, "Who is David, and who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants today who are each breaking away from his master." At first glance at verse 10, it would seem from Nabal's words that he does not even know who David is. If this were true, Nabal would simply be refusing a gift to a stranger. But Nabal does know who David is. And from his own words later in verse 10, he informs us that David is the son of Jesse. Nabal knows much more than this, and we'll see this later. Not only does he know that David is the son of Jesse, he is also well aware of the tension between Saul and David. Nabal speaks of David as a servant of Saul who is breaking away from his master. Abigail, Nabal's wife, knows that David is the one designated to reign in Saul's place, as we'll see later on in verses 30 and 31. Nabal, however, speaks only of David as a servant who has fled from his master, as though he were a mere runaway slave. His message to David is not the one of fear of reprisal, but one of pure selfishness and meanness. He will not share with David and his men anything that is actually his. In verse 11, the repeated use of the word my. David's men return to him empty-handed. They repeat Nabal's words to David, and David loses his cool. Tells them to strap on their swords. David barks his order at his men and straps on his own sword and heads out to make Nabal pay in a very different way, with his life and with the life of every male in his household. David is angry. He is angry because his actions have not brought about the result he expected. From his point of view, he has dealt kindly with Nabal. And now it is time for Nabal to deal kindly with him. But instead of giving a blessing to David and his men, Nabal insults them and sends them away empty-handed. David concludes that all of his good works are for nothing. If Nabal will return evil for good, David is now justified in returning evil for evil. In reading this, I couldn't help but think about how I would have reacted in this situation. And all too many of us, we do reason the same way as David here. But we are clearly wrong in doing so. David is wrong to expect good. He's wrong to expect that he'll get good in return. Think about how David has done good for Saul, but he has faithfully served him and refused to take his life when given the chance. But Saul, what did he do? He responded with evil continually. And he actually confessed this to David in 1 Samuel 24, verse 17. David is somehow willing to deal with the mistreatment Saul hands out, but not with the insults of Nabal. Why would this be? Well, first of all, Saul is David's superior in terms of authority. David is Saul's servant. He is willing to take unfair treatment from his superior because of this. And secondly, we could consider that David has been promised the kingdom once Saul is out of the picture. David can handle Saul or abuse from Saul because he knows that before long he will fill Saul's vacated throne. In contrast, Nabal is not David's superior, and he does not at all like the treatment he receives from him. Furthermore, David is not thinking or acting like a man of faith when he sets out to kill Nabal and all the males in his household. David expects an immediate return on his investment of serving Nabal. He expects the reward to come from Nabal. Now, he is not looking for a heavenly reward at that point. And again, bringing this back to us today, how many of us minister to others with a measuring stick in our hand? We are willing to love and serve others sacrificially, but with a certain set of expectations. We expect that our sacrificial love and service should be reciprocated. When in return for our good doing, our neighbor gives us evil, like David, we will get a little hot under the collar and look for some way to retaliate. We forget that, like Christ, our words and deeds may actually bring about persecution and suffering, rather than approval and gratitude. Our reward in heaven will be great, but there may be no such rewards on earth. It may be a painful time on earth. So we need to be careful to do our good works as to the Lord, looking for Him for the reward and not the recipients of our sacrificial service. David may have learned here that the problem with acting like a servant is that people begin to treat you like a servant. It is one thing to serve in order to be promoted. It is something quite different to serve to be demoted. As we move into verses 14 through 17, we read about a secret appeal to Abigail. One of the young men who served Nabal observes the encounter between David's servants and Nabal. He knows how much David and his men have benefited his master, and how offensive Nabal's response will be to David. Somehow he knows that David is coming, and that if something dramatic is not done quickly, there will be trouble for all. He also knows that Nabal is a fool, with whom David could not reason. And so the servant does not speak to Nabal, but quickly appraises Abigail of the situation and the need for decisive action. It seems this servant has a great regard for Abigail and her judgment, which is the reason he seeks her out. He does not suggest to Abigail what she should do, but simply tells her the facts and urges her to act with the wisdom she is known to have. So after she is told these things, Abigail responds, and we'll see in this text from verse 18 through 22 that Abigail responds and then David reacts. We must take note that Abigail does not ask or inform Nabal about what she is doing. She does not ask because she likely knows what Nabal's answer will be. She does not inform him of what she is doing because he will no doubt order his servants to do as she has instructed. We'll soon see that Abigail's actions are an example of true submission, even though they don't seem to be that way on the surface. Acting quickly, Abigail gathers up generous portions of food, which she sends on ahead by her servants. Speed is of the essence, so she sends the supplies out ahead of the time. David is on his way, and he is determined to kill every male he encounters at Nabal's house, including Nabal. It would seem that the supplies reach David and his men before Abigail does, although we're not specifically told this. We are told only that she sends the supplies ahead of time as to not delay David's reception of his gift. Having sent the food gift on ahead, Abigail works her way down the mountain, out of sight to David and his men. David likewise comes down from the higher ground, only he is still grumbling about Nabal's insults and rehearsing what he will do when he gets his hand upon the ungrateful person. Without either party realizing or recognizing what is happening, David and Abigail are both converging on each other, we read, and suddenly they are face to face with each other. In verses 23 through 31, we see how the wise words of Abigail really tend to settle David down. Suddenly the paths of Abigail and David intersect, and Abigail promptly dismounts her donkey, falling on her face before David, just as David did before Saul in the last chapter. Everything Abigail does and says conveys her attitude of submission to David. 6 times in these verses, Abigail speaks of herself as David's maidservant. And 14 times she refers to David as my Lord. She begins by pleading with David to place all the blame on her alone. Excuse me. Does David plan to avenge himself by killing Nabal and all the males in his household, she asked. Abigail pleads with David to take out his anger on her, if he must. In this, Abigail not only attempts to save the life of her husband, but the lives of her household as well. In addition to offering herself as a scapegoat for David's wrath, Abigail petitions David to listen to the words that she wants to speak to him. In this regard, David is very different from Nabal, who does not listen to anyone, as we were told in verse 17. To his credit and his gain, David does listen. She begins by pleading with him not to take her husband Nabal seriously. She informs David that she has had no part of Nabal's decision to insult him and send his servants away empty-handed. The donkeys standing nearby, laden down with supplies, certainly add credence to her statement. She tells David that her husband's character is aptly depicted by his name Nabal, which literally means fool. After trying to convince David that the killing of Nabal will not be worth the effort, she now presses on to show David how taking vengeance will actually be detrimental to him. She begins by pointing out that the Lord has restrained David from shedding blood and from avenging himself. Out of that, the Lord has from avenging himself by his own hand in verse 26. She expresses her certainty that if David leaves vengeance to God, God will deal appropriately with Nabal, as with the others who seek evil against David. Abigail actually pleads with David to accept the gift she brings and to share it with his men. She begs David to forgive her transgression against him, as though all the guilt is hers. Then she comes to her finest moment. She assures David that he will become Israel's king and that his kingdom will last. David fights the Lord's battles, she says, and for this reason evil shall not be found in him all of his days. If anyone does rise up against David to seek his life, David should know that his life is precious to God. On the other hand, the lives of his enemies are worthless. God will sling them out as from the hollow of a sling, is the text that was used there. For Abigail, there is no doubt about it. David is Israel's next king. God's promise to David about this matter will be fulfilled, and God will appoint him ruler over Israel, in verse 30. How tragic it would be in this situation for David to have a dark cloud over that kingdom, a cloud brought about by his own impetuous acts of seeking vengeance and shedding innocent blood. Nabal has insulted David. That is a crime. The males of his household have done no wrong to David, or his men, as so far as we are told. To kill Nabal and the males of his household for being selfish and insulting is to shed innocent blood, because the punishment is worse than the crime. As we move on into verses 32 through 35, we see David's response. Abigail's words ring true to David. What she says squares with all that God has taught David. He knows she is right, and he now admits it by praising her before all of his men. David recognizes that Abigail is literally a godsend, and that by means of her words and deeds, God has kept him from doing wrong, and by taking vengeance against Nabal, and thus shedding innocent blood. Granting her request, David then accepts the gift from Abigail and sends her home in peace. In verses 36 through 38, we read about Nabal being struck down. Completely oblivious to the stupidity of his actions and how close he has come to death, Nabal is feasting like a king in his house when Abigail returns. We read he is merry at heart, probably only happens when he is drunk. Wisely, Abigail says nothing to her husband about the day's events at this time. As morning breaks, Nabal awakens with a clearer head, and so Abigail informs him of all that had happened the previous day. We're told the color drained from Nabal's face as he begins to comprehend the magnitude of his folly. He is paralyzed with fear. Our text actually reads, his heart died within him, so that he became as a stone. And we're told 10 days later, the Lord strikes Nabal dead. So as we close out chapter 25 and verses 39 through 44, word reaches David that Nabal is dead. David responds with wonder and gratitude. He praises God for pleading his cause and removing the reproach of Nabal. He declares that God has indeed kept him from evil. He sees how much better it is to have left vengeance with God instead of taking it into his own hands. The Lord removed Nabal, not David. This is the way that it was supposed to be, and it is all due to the wisdom of Abigail. David's messengers arrive at the door of Abigail's home They have a simple message. It is not quite a proposal of marriage, but more like a summons. We read, it says, David has sent us to take you as his wife. This decisive woman does not have to be asked twice. Quickly she bows to the ground, humbly accepting the offer. She does not look at herself as David's queen, but as his maidservant, who will happily wash the feet of his servants. She gets up and, accompanied by 5 of her maidens, follows David's men to the place of hiding, where she becomes David's wife. Now then, moving on to chapter 26. Okay, moving along. Chapter 26, we're talking again about the Ziphites. We have met the Ziphites before. Back in chapter 23, we were told that the Ziphites went up to Saul at his home in Gibeah, informing him of David's whereabouts and promising to deliver him over to the king. Now, once again, we find the Ziphites betraying David to Saul. When the Ziphites come to Saul, he is not in the wilderness as Ziph, threatening the lives of those who would withhold information about David's whereabouts. He is actually at home, having given up his pursuit of David, at least for a time. But with the arrival of these helpful informers, Saul is once again prompted to go after David. Saul returns to the wilderness of Ziph, accompanied by 3,000 of his best soldiers. This time he does not intend on letting David get away. Saul pitches camp on the hill of Hachilah, close to the road. David remains in one of the more remote parts of the wilderness. This time things are going to be a lot different than the last time these two men met in this place. The first time David was seeking to retreat while Saul was advancing. Now it is Saul's soldiers who are camped out, and it is David who is actually taking the initiative. David's spies locate Saul's camp and inform David, who approaches with his men. David looks down on Saul's camp and sees Saul asleep in the center of the camp, easily identified by his size, his armor or apparel, and most certainly by his spear. Next to Saul lies his uncle and commander of the army, Abner. From Saul and Abner, in the center radiate his 3,000 soldiers in a circle. In verses 6 through 12, we see how the tables have turned somewhat, in that David was always fleeing from Saul. In this case, David goes to Saul. David's scouts locate Saul's camp, and accompanied by at least 2 men, David goes to the campsite. 2 men seem to be near David: Ahimelech the Hittite. This is not to be confused with Ahimelech the priest, who was killed by Saul, and another person named Abishai. David speaks to these men, requesting that one of them go with him down to Saul's camp. Ahimelech appears to remain silent from what we see in the text, while Abishai volunteers. Imagine for a moment that you're Abishai here. Saul has carefully positioned himself at the innermost part of a circle of his troops. Abner, a heroic warrior and Saul's bodyguard, is lying right next to the king. You carefully pick your way through this maze of human bodies, fearing that at any moment someone will awaken. You can hardly believe you have actually made it as you stand there with David looking down at Saul sleeping peacefully with Abner close by. Close to Saul's head is his spear thrust into the ground. If you're keeping yourself as Abishai here, it would not take you long to figure out what should come next. Knowing from the incident in the cave that David is squeamish about killing Saul, Abishai whispers to David, "God has delivered Saul into your hand today. Now, then, let me finish Saul off with his own spear. It will only take one blow, I assure you." Abishai likely reasons that if David is reluctant to do it, he will. Surely David did not ask for volunteers to come down here with him, only to look at the king and then leave. You have to figure that was an interesting debate between the two, as they strongly disagree, yet desperately try to keep from waking up Saul or any of his men. But we read that David forbids Abishai to kill Saul for essentially the same reasons he verbalized in the cave in chapter 24. No one can lift his hand against the Lord's anointed without incurring guilt. In verse 10, David goes beyond what he has said before, saying, "As surely as God lives, he will be the one to remove Saul." David assures Abishai. David has come for Saul's spear and water container, and that is all. So he takes up Saul's spear and water jug, instructing Abishai to come along with him. Whether they knew it or not at that time, the author of our text informs us that this was not just a stroke of good luck or even a good military maneuver. God had put these 3,000 men to sleep. David and Abishai could have been yelling at each other and no one would have awakened. In verses 13 through 16, we read about the rude awakening of Saul. David and Abishai leave the camp, and David waits to call out until he has crossed over what seems to be a valley. Then, standing far from Saul's reach, on top of a mountain, David cries out to the people in general, and to Abner in particular. The soldiers of Saul are apparently awakened by the sound of David's voice. Not seeing who is calling out, Abner does not recognize David's voice. There is a reason why David cries out to the soldiers and to Abner in particular. David indicts the entire group for not properly protecting the king. And for this, David insists that their failure should cost them their lives. As we read David's words to Abner and to the others, we begin to grasp the reasons behind David's perplexing invasion into Saul's camp. David did not go down to Saul's camp frivolously as a kind of a spur-of-the-moment prank. He had a plan, which actually worked out just as he expected. When David asked for a volunteer, Abishai stepped forward, just as likely David anticipated. Abishai was a mighty man of valor. We read in 2 Samuel chapter 23. David likely knew he would be anxious to go. Abishai is a stout-hearted soldier, a man who has no qualms about taking the life of another. David took Abishai along with him, knowing full well that Abishai would want to kill Saul when they reached the camp. Those to whom David call out are soldiers. They were there to arrest David, whom some represented as a dangerous outlaw, determined to gain the throne by killing Saul. If this were the case, or even if it were not, they are Saul's secret servicemen. David informs him that they have failed in their primary mission, their most important duty, to protect their king. David claims a would-be killer successfully penetrated their defenses and reached their king, fully intending to do him harm. Only because David stopped Abishai, is the king still breathing. And David is right. While David did not approach Saul to kill him, this was surely Abishai's intention. The only reason Abishai did not kill the king was that David stopped him. If any doubted one had come close to Saul, look for the king's spear and water jug. You have to imagine the dismay of these, especially for Abner, when they look at the ground inches from Saul's head and see the hole where the head of the spear was, and the missing water jug, and perhaps a pair of footprints leading to the spear and back. David invites Saul's security force to send a man up to him to retrieve those missing items. David has a spear, and he has made his point. In truth, David saved the king's life again. In verses 17 through 20, we see that David speaks with Saul. Saul slowly comes to his senses. He overhears the conversation between Abner and David in a distant voice. Saul knows that voice. He knows it is none other than David. He has already heard enough to soften him. He actually says in the text, "Is this your voice, my son David?" David acknowledges that it is indeed he. From here, David takes the lead, inquiring of Saul why he is pursuing him again. He asks Saul, what evil deed has he done to necessitate such action on Saul's part? And there is, of course, no good answer from Saul. What follows is even more intriguing. David pleads with Saul to listen to his words and to consider what he is about to say. It is wrong for Saul to seek to kill David, for he has done the king no wrong. Indeed, he has just saved the king's life. But having pointed this out, David pursues the matter more deeply in terms of its theological implications. In verses 19 and 20, God is prominent, and so are the spiritual consequences of Saul's pursuit of David. I want to actually read verses 19 and 20 here. "Now therefore, please let my lord the king listen to the words of his servant. If the Lord has stirred up you against me, let him accept an offering. But if it is men, cursed are they before the Lord, for they have driven me out today, so that I would have no attachment with the inheritance of the Lord, saying, go serve other gods. Now then, do not let my blood fall on the ground fall to the ground, away from the presence of the Lord, for the king of Israel has come out to search for a single flea, just as one hunts a partridge in the mountains." Saul obviously believes that David is guilty of some wrongdoing, so that he needs to be hunted down and eliminated. We know of Saul's jealousy of David, but one feels like there must be more. David shows that there can only be two sources from which Saul could come to these conclusions. On the one hand, it is possible that David has truly sinned against Saul, and that the Lord has stirred up Saul to deal with this evil. If this is the case, Saul needs only tell David what his sin is, and David can obtain atonement for his sin by offering a sacrifice, which God will find acceptable. If this is the case, there is no need for Saul to pursue David or punish David, since God has forgiven him. But there's another possibility. If David is innocent, then there must be those who have wrongly accused David before Saul, characterizing him as a dangerous criminal, worthy of death. If this second possibility is true, then such false accusers are under a curse before the Lord. It is not David who is worthy of death, but those who have wrongly accused David before Saul. The sin of such men goes even beyond making false accusations against David. In provoking Saul to pursue David, they have forced an innocent man to flee from his country. It is they, aided by Saul, who have driven David out of Israel. The spiritual implications here are immense. To leave the country, as David has had to do, is to have no attachment with the inheritance of the Lord. We read in verse 19. To force a true Israelite to leave this land is to go so far as to say, go serve other gods. We're also told in verse 19. Those who pursue David have now placed themselves in a most dangerous position. David has been able to come and go into their camp. He has been able to reach Saul's side, take his spear, without any resistance. If he had chosen to do so, he could have killed Saul. And yet it is David who saves the king's life, and not the king's own men. They have failed to protect their king. They, not David, are worthy of death. Not only do they deserve to die at the hand of Saul, they deserve to die at the hand of God. By accusing David and forcing him to flee the country, they are promoting the worship of false gods. They are condemned men. They are in a lot of trouble with their king and with their God. This incident shows that if not for David, whose life is in danger as much as those who pursue him or who falsely accuse him to their king. In verse 20, David pleads with Saul that his blood should not be shed outside of the land, away from the presence of the Lord. There is no need for Saul to pursue him so vigorously. Searching for David is like searching for a single flea, like hunting a partridge in the mountains. It is a whole lot of work with very little benefit. It is futile, if not dangerous. And he's imploring to him, let the king forsake his pursuit and cease listening to those who pit Saul against David. In verses 21 through 25, we read about Saul's reply. David does not use Saul's spear against him, but Saul gets the point. Saul recognizes his own sin in dealing with David, but the most significant word is return. Has Saul been a part of the sin of driving David out of the land, away from the opportunity to worship God? Then he would now confess his sin and give up his pursuit of David so that he may safely return to the place of worship. Because David regards Saul's life as precious, Saul promises to regard David's life as precious. Saul confesses that he has sinned, and that in his sin he has been guilty of the very serious error to which David refers. In response to Saul's confession and promise of amnesty, David shouts, "Behold, the spear of the king. Now let one of the young men come over and take it." It does appear, as some have observed, that the spear was a symbol of authority in the ancient world. David does not presume to keep the symbol of authority that belongs to Saul, so he calls for one of Saul's men to fetch it. Would some say that David is a sinner, a traitor, an enemy of Saul? David concludes his defense by asserting his righteousness in verses 23 and 24. It is the Lord who will repay each person for his righteousness and faithfulness, David reminds his pursuers. Although the Lord delivers Saul into David's hand, David does him no harm because he is the Lord's anointed. David therefore looks to the Lord to reward him for his deeds this night. While Saul and his men put themselves in jeopardy by accusing and pursuing David as a sinner and a criminal, David is assured that his life is safe in the hands of God. As David has highly valued the life of Saul, he knows that God will highly value his life, and thus he is assured that God will deliver him from all his distresses. In verse 24, Saul's final words are a pronouncement of blessing on David, with the assurance that he will accomplish great things, and that in the end David will prevail. With these words, the two men part company for the last time. They shall not meet again because of the time of Saul's death is drawing near. Saul returns to his place, but David goes on his way. David knows better than to think Saul's repentance will last. There is a message here to those like Saul and his men who wrongly accuse David. God defends his own. There is no way that God's anointed can be removed from before God's time. This was true of Saul. It was also true of David. In this brief period of time, God turned the tables on the enemies of David. It was not David who was in grave danger, but those who opposed him. Let the enemies of God's chosen ones take note, and let his chosen ones take courage in that. For David, the events of this chapter are a high water mark for David's grasp of God's truth and for the application of it in his life. David stood tall outside of the cave in chapter 24, but he stands even taller in chapter 26. He is confident of God's protection in the cave and of him as the one who still rewards his righteousness and judges his accusers. If in chapter 24 we see David gently rebuking Saul, rebuking his king, in chapter 26 we see him rebuking those who have set the king against him. David now sees his flight from his enemies in terms of the spiritual implications. If David has grown spiritually after the events of chapter 24, and this growth is evident in chapter 26, we must conclude that Abigail plays a significant role in this. The things David affirms as true in chapter 26 are the very things which Abigail assures him. If David has any doubt that he will become the next king, Abigail assures him that he will reign over Israel, in verse 30. Though David wants to take vengeance on his enemies, like Nabal, Abigail reminds him that God will better handle such situations, and that leaving this to God will keep David away from his regrets. Does David fear for his life? Abigail assures him that his life is safe in God's hands. It is said that behind many great men there is a great woman, and certainly that was true of David and Abigail in this situation. That wraps it up for today. Thank you for your attention. Next week we will try to get through chapters 27, 28, and partially through 29. Thank you very much.